Amelia Nelson's heart thundered against her ribs as she raced across the dusty prairie, the relentless summer sun of 1878 beating down on her back, while gunshots cracked through the air behind her. She'd never imagined her journey west would end like this, running for her life from the very man who'd promised to escort her safely to Fort Smith. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as her pursuer closed the distance between them, her lungs burning with each desperate breath as she stumbled toward the distant line of cottonwoods that promised the only shelter for miles. Amelia had arrived in Texas just 3 weeks prior, a Boston-bred schoolteacher with dreams of bringing education to the frontier. Now those dreams seemed foolish as the reality of the untamed West closed in around her. The man she'd hired as guide had revealed his true intentions once they were far from civilization, and she'd barely escaped his clutches when he'd fallen into a drunken sleep. The thunder of approaching hooves made her heart sink. She couldn't outrun a horse, not across open country. Amelia ducked behind a large boulder, pressing her back against the sun-warmed stone as she tried to quiet her breathing. The rider would pass her by, she prayed. He would continue down the trail, assuming she'd headed for the distant trees. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped altogether. Amelia held her breath. "Madam," called a deep voice, different from her attacker's slurred drawl. "I don't mean you any harm." Amelia remained silent, clutching the small knife she'd stolen from her guide's saddlebag. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. "The man who was chasing you is lying unconscious about a quarter-mile back," the voice continued. "I saw what happened from the ridge. You're safe now." Cautiously, Amelia peered around the edge of the boulder. A tall man sat atop a magnificent chestnut horse, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His posture was relaxed, one hand resting on his saddle horn, the other holding the reins loosely. There was nothing threatening in his stance, but Amelia had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. "How do I know I can trust you?" she called out, her voice shaking despite her effort to sound brave. The man dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He was dressed in worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days. A gun hung at his hip, but he made no move toward it. "You don't," he replied simply. "But you're miles from anywhere with no water and no horse. Night's coming, and so is a storm." He gestured toward the darkening western horizon. "I can take you to safety, or I can leave you be. Your choice, madam." Amelia weighed her options. They were, as he pointed out, severely limited. She was exhausted, thirsty, and lost. The bruises on her wrists where her guide had grabbed her were beginning to darken, and her feet were blistered from running in inappropriate shoes. "What's your name?" she asked, still hiding mostly behind the boulder. "Hank Lawson, madam." "I run cattle about 15 miles east of here." Something in his straightforward manner and steady gaze convinced Amelia he was telling the truth. Slowly, she stepped out from behind her shelter, the knife still clutched in her trembling hand. "I'm Amelia Nelson," she said. "I was hired as the new schoolteacher in Fort Smith," Hank nodded. "Figured you weren't from around here." His eyes took in her torn dress, once fine but now covered in dust and sweat. "Can you ride, Miss Nelson?" "Yes, though it's been some time." Hank approached his horse and adjusted the stirrups. "Rusty here is gentle as they come. I'll walk alongside and lead him. My ranch isn't far, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Wilkins, will be glad for female company." Amelia hesitated only briefly before accepting his outstretched hand. His palm was calloused, but his touch was gentle as he helped her into the saddle. As promised, he walked beside the horse, leading them eastward as the first distant rumbles of thunder rolled across the prairie. They traveled in silence for a while, Amelia gradually relaxing as Hank made no threatening moves. He seemed content to walk at a steady pace, occasionally glancing up at the approaching storm clouds. "May I ask what happened back there?" he finally said, his voice gentle. Amelia stiffened. "I hired a guide in Caldwell to take me to Fort Smith. He had other intentions." Hank's jaw tightened. Man by the name of Fletcher, Amelia nodded, surprised. He's got a reputation, Hank said grimly. Local authorities haven't been able to pin anything on him yet, but there've been stories. You're lucky to have gotten away. What did you do to him? Amelia asked. A small, satisfied smile crossed Hank's face. Let's just say he won't be bothering anyone for a while. I left him tied to his horse with a note explaining his crimes. Sheriff Dawson will handle him from there. The first fat raindrops began to fall as a small ranch house came into view. It wasn't large, but it was well maintained, with a barn and corral nearby and smoke curling from the chimney. A woman in her 60s stood on the porch, squinting at their approach. Hank Lawson, who have you got there? She called as they neared. Found Miss Nelson in a spot of trouble, Mrs. Wilkins, Hank called back. She could use some dry clothes and a hot meal if you don't mind. The older woman's face softened as she took in Amelia's bedraggled appearance. Of course not. Come in out of this rain, child, before you catch your death. Hank helped Amelia down from the horse just as the sky opened up in earnest. They dashed for the porch, rain soaking them in the short distance from where Rusty stood to the shelter of the overhang. Mrs. Wilkins bustled Amelia inside and toward a small bedroom. You get out of those wet things, dear. I'll find you something to wear. Hank keeps some of his sister's old clothes here for when she visits. Alone in the tidy bedroom, Amelia finally allowed herself to tremble. The events of the day crashed over her like the storm outside, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her face. She'd been so naive, so trusting. She'd nearly paid for that trust with her life or worse. A soft knock at the door made her hastily wipe her eyes. Mrs. Wilkins entered with a bundle of clothing and a towel. There now, the older woman said kindly. You have yourself a good cry if you need to. Then come have some hot stew. Everything looks better on a full stomach. When Amelia emerged from the bedroom some time later, dressed in a simple blue calico dress that was a bit too large but clean and dry, she found Hank and Mrs. Wilkins seated at a wooden table in the kitchen. A pot of stew bubbled on the stove, filling the room with a savory aroma that made Amelia's stomach growl. Feel better? Hank asked, standing as she entered. Amelia nodded, somewhat embarrassed by his old-fashioned manners. In Boston, gentlemen stood when a lady entered the room, but she hadn't expected such courtesy in the wilds of Texas. Thank you for the clothes, she said, and for your help earlier. No need for thanks, Hank replied, pulling out a chair for her. Any decent man would have done the same. Mrs. Wilkins snorted as she ladled stew into bowls. Plenty of men out here who aren't decent, as the young lady discovered today. They ate in companionable silence, the rain drumming on the roof a soothing counterpoint to the occasional rumble of thunder. As Amelia's hunger was satisfied, exhaustion began to overtake her. She fought to keep her eyes open, not wanting to appear rude. You're dead on your feet, Mrs. Wilkins observed. Finish your tea and then off to bed with you. We can sort everything out in the morning. Amelia didn't argue. After thanking her hosts again, she retired to the small bedroom and was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. The next morning dawned clear and fresh, the storm having washed the world clean. Amelia woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the low murmur of voices from the kitchen. She dressed quickly and joined Hank and Mrs. Wilkins, who were deep in conversation that ceased when she entered. Good morning, she said, suddenly self-conscious. Morning, Miss Nelson, Hank replied, again rising from his chair. Hope you slept well. Better than I expected to, thank you. Mrs. Wilkins placed a plate of eggs and bacon before her. Eat up. You and Hank have things to discuss. Amelia looked between them, questioning. What things? Hank cleared his throat. I sent one of my ranch hands to Fort Smith last night with news of what happened. He returned this morning. Already? Amelia was surprised. That's a long ride to make in a night. Jim's a good rider and I've got good horses, Hank said with a small smile. The thing is, Miss Nelson, there's been a misunderstanding. The school in Fort Smith filled their teaching position 2 weeks ago. The man who was supposed to send you the telegram informing you of this fell ill and never sent the message. Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. But that can't be. I have a contract. I'm afraid the contract was with the previous schoolmaster who died suddenly. The town council decided they needed someone immediately and couldn't wait for you to arrive from Boston. The room seemed to spin around Amelia. She'd spent nearly all her savings on the journey west. The small amount she had left wouldn't get her back to Boston, and even if it could, what would she do there? She'd given up her position at the girls' school, sold most of her possessions, and said goodbye to the few friends she had. I see, she said faintly, setting down her fork. Her appetite had vanished. Now, don't you worry, Mrs. Wilkins said firmly. Hank has a proposal for you. Hank shot the older woman a quelling look before turning back to Amelia. It's not much, but there are about a dozen children on neighboring ranches who have no schooling at all. The nearest proper school is in Fort Smith, too far for daily travel. We've been talking about hiring a teacher and setting up a small schoolhouse, but haven't found the right person. Hope flickered in Amelia's chest. Are you offering me a position? It wouldn't be what you're used to, Hank warned. Just a simple building, basic supplies. The pay would come from the parents mostly in goods rather than cash, I expect. You'd have to live here at the ranch. There's no other suitable accommodation nearby. He means you'd have to put up with my cooking and his occasional grumpiness, Mrs. Wilkins interjected with a smile. Amelia considered the offer. It wasn't what she'd planned, but it was a chance to teach, to be useful. And after her experience with Fletcher, the thought of staying somewhere safe with people she was beginning to trust was appealing. I accept, she said firmly. When can I start? Hank's face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his weathered features. We'll need to build the schoolhouse first. That'll take a few weeks. In the meantime, you can get to know the area and the families. Over the next month, Amelia settled into life at the Lawson Ranch. True to his word, Hank organized the neighboring ranchers to help build a small but sturdy schoolhouse about a quarter-mile from the main house. Amelia was touched by the community's enthusiasm for the project and their warm welcome of her. She learned that Hank had come to Texas 10 years earlier, after serving in the Union Army during the Civil War. He'd built his ranch from nothing, starting with just a few head of cattle and gradually expanding until he was one of the most respected ranchers in the area. Mrs. Wilkins had been with him almost from the beginning, having lost her husband and son in the war and having nowhere else to go. As they worked side by side, Hank building benches and a teacher's desk, while Amelia planned lessons and organized the few books that had been donated, she found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet, thoughtful cowboy. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, with his sun-weathered skin and the small scar that ran along his jawline, but there was a steadiness to him that Amelia found immensely attractive. For his part, Hank seemed to enjoy her company as well. He began finding reasons to escort her on rides around the property, showing her hidden springs and spectacular vistas. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset and talking about everything from books to cattle breeding. The schoolhouse was completed by mid-August, just in time for classes to begin before the fall roundup would keep many of the older boys away helping their fathers. 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 15 showed up on the first day, their faces a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Amelia felt a surge of purpose as she stood before them. This was why she'd come west to bring knowledge to those who might otherwise go without. The classroom might be simpler than what she was used to in Boston, but the eager faces before her made all her struggles worthwhile. As the weeks passed, Amelia fell into a comfortable routine. She taught during the day, helped Mrs. Wilkins with household chores in the late afternoon, and spent her evenings with Hank. Sometimes they read aloud to each other from one of the few books in his small library. Other times they simply talked, Amelia sharing stories of her childhood in Boston while Hank spoke of his experiences during the war and his early days in Texas. One evening in late September, They sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. A comfortable silence had fallen between them when Hank suddenly spoke. "Why did you come west, Amelia?" "Really?" She looked at him, surprised by the question. "To teach, of course." Hank shook his head slightly. "There are plenty of schools in the East that would have been glad to have you." "Why leave everything familiar to come to a place so different?" Amelia considered the question. No one had asked her that before, not in such a direct way. "I suppose I was looking for something," she said slowly. "Not just a teaching position, but a purpose. A place where I could make a real difference." She smiled ruefully. "That sounds terribly self-important, doesn't it?" "Not at all," Hank said quietly. "I understand the need to find your place in the world." His hand rested on the arm of his chair, just inches from hers. Without thinking, Amelia reached over and placed her fingers lightly on his. Hank looked down at their hands, then up at her face. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for weeks. Before either could speak, Mrs. Wilkins called from inside that she needed help with a leaky water pump. The moment was broken, but not forgotten. As autumn progressed, the dynamics between Amelia and Hank shifted subtly. Their casual touches lingered longer. Their gazes held more meaning. Yet neither seemed willing to be the first to speak of what was developing between them. Everything changed on a crisp October afternoon. Amelia had dismissed her students early because of an approaching storm and was hurrying back to the ranch house when the skies opened. Cold rain drenched her within seconds, and by the time she reached the barn, the closest shelter, she was shivering violently. Hank was inside, mending a bridle. He looked up in alarm as she stumbled through the door. "Amelia, you're soaked through." He quickly removed his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders, guiding her to a bench near the small stove he used for heating tools. "Tea, thank you," she managed through chattering teeth. "The rain caught me by surprise." Hank stoked the stove and added more wood, then pulled a horse blanket from a nearby shelf. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said practically. "Wrap yourself in this blanket. I'll turn my back." Amelia hesitated only briefly before recognizing the sense in his suggestion. Hypothermia was a real danger, especially with the temperature dropping as it was. She nodded, and Hank turned to face the wall, giving her privacy. With stiff fingers, Amelia unbuttoned her sodden dress and petticoats, hanging them on a nail near the stove to dry. "Wrapped in the rough but warm blanket," she called. "You can turn around now." Hank did so, his eyes carefully on her face rather than the bare shoulders visible above the blanket. He poured a cup of coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the stove and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup gratefully. "You seem prepared for everything." "When you live out here, you learn to expect the unexpected," he replied with a small smile. He sat beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the rain drumming on the barn roof and the occasional rumble of thunder. Amelia gradually stopped shivering as warmth returned to her body. "Why haven't you ever married, Hank?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. If Hank was taken aback, he didn't show it. "Never found the right woman, I suppose, or maybe I did, but the timing wasn't right." He looked at her then, his eyes serious. "What about you? A beautiful, educated woman like yourself must have had suitors in Boston." Amelia blushed at the compliment. "A few," she admitted, "but none that I could imagine spending my life with. They all seemed so predictable. They wanted a wife who would host dinner parties and raise children, not one with ideas about education and women's suffrage." Hank chuckled. "You'd certainly never be accused of being predictable, Amelia Nelson." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to charge with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Hank's gaze dropped to her lips, and Amelia felt her heart begin to race. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Hank leaned forward. His lips met hers in a gentle, questioning kiss that nonetheless sent a jolt of sensation through Amelia's entire body. She responded instinctively, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they parted, Hank's eyes searched hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why didn't you?" Amelia asked softly. "I wasn't sure if you felt the same way, and I didn't want to take advantage of your situation." Amelia set her coffee cup aside and placed her palm against his cheek. "I'm here because I choose to be, Hank. Not because of circumstances, but because I've come to care for you deeply." This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation. Hank's arms encircled her, pulling her closer as the blanket slipped slightly from her shoulders. His touch was both gentle and urgent, conveying months of restrained desire. A particularly loud crack of thunder broke them apart, both breathing heavily. Hank rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "We should stop," he said reluctantly. "Before I forget that I'm trying to be a gentleman." Amelia smiled, touching his face again. "Always the honorable man." The rain eventually subsided and they made their way back to the house, Amelia dressed in her now damp but no longer soaking clothes. Mrs. Wilkins took one look at them and pursed her lips knowingly but said nothing as she bustled about preparing dinner. That night, after Mrs. Wilkins had retired to her room, Hank and Amelia sat before the fireplace, hands entwined. "I want to court you properly," Hank said seriously. "If you'll allow it." Amelia squeezed his hand. "I would like that very much." The following weeks were some of the happiest of Amelia's life. Hank courted her with an old-fashioned gallantry that touched her deeply. He brought her wildflowers, took her on picnics in his favorite spots around the ranch, and one memorable evening, taught her to dance in the main room of the house while Mrs. Wilkins played the old piano. As autumn gave way to winter, however, a shadow fell across their happiness. News came that Fletcher had escaped from jail in Caldwell and was rumored to be seeking revenge against both Hank and Amelia. "I'm not concerned," Hank insisted when Amelia expressed her fears. "Fletcher is a coward who preys on the weak. He won't come within 10 miles of this ranch." Despite his reassurances, Hank took precautions. He made sure Amelia was never alone, escorting her to and from the schoolhouse each day. The ranch hands were told to be on the lookout for strangers, and Hank kept his rifle closer than usual. December arrived with a cold snap that coated the landscape in frost. The children were excited about the approaching Christmas holiday, and Amelia was planning a small pageant for the community. She stayed late at the schoolhouse one afternoon, preparing decorations, having assured Hank she would be fine for the short time before he came to escort her home. As she pinned the last paper star to the wall, the door creaked open. Expecting to see Hank, Amelia turned with a smile that froze on her face when she saw Fletcher standing in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. "Well, well," he drawled, his bloodshot eyes taking in her startled expression with satisfaction. "The fancy Boston schoolteacher. Been looking for you for quite a while." Amelia's mouth went dry with fear, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Mr. Fletcher, what do you want?" "What do I want?" he laughed, an ugly sound. "I want the 6 months of my life back that I spent in that jail. I want my reputation back. I want that cowboy of yours to pay for what he did." He moved further into the room, closing the door behind him. Amelia backed away until she hit the wall. "Hank will be here any minute," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm counting on it," Fletcher replied with a malicious grin. "That's why I waited until now. I want him to find you, or what's left of you." Amelia's mind raced. She needed to stall to keep him talking until Hank arrived. "You won't get away with this. The authorities already know what kind of man you are." Fletcher's face darkened. "Shut up. You think you're so much better than me, don't you? With your fancy education and your fine manners." He waved the gun menacingly. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Outside, Amelia heard the faint sound of hoofbeats. Hank was coming. But would he be cautious, sensing danger, or would he walk unknowingly into Fletcher's trap? Fletcher heard it too. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Right on time." Moving swiftly, Amelia grabbed the heavy brass bell from her desk and hurled it at Fletcher with all her strength. It struck him in the shoulder, causing him to stagger backward. The gun went off, the bullet splintering the wood above Amelia's head as she ducked and ran for the door. Fletcher lunged for her, catching her arm in a painful grip. They struggled, Amelia fighting with a desperation born of fear, not just for herself but for Hank as well. The door burst open and Hank stood framed in the doorway, his own gun drawn. "Let her go, Fletcher," he said, his voice deadly calm. Fletcher yanked Amelia in front of him, using her as a shield. "Drop your gun, Lawson, or I'll put a bullet in her pretty head." Time seemed to slow. Amelia could feel Fletcher's ragged breathing against her neck, smell the stale whiskey on his breath. She met Hank's eyes, saw the calculation there, and understood what he was planning in one fluid motion. Amelia stomped hard on Fletcher's instep and threw herself to the floor as Hank fired. The bullet caught Fletcher in the chest, and he collapsed backward, his gun clattering to the floor unfired. Hank was at Amelia's side in an instant, helping her to her feet and checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands gentle as they cupped her face. "No," she assured him, though she was trembling violently. "Just shaken." Hank pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. "When I saw him with his hands on you," his voice broke, "I've never been so scared in my life." Amelia clung to him, the reality of what had just happened washing over her in waves. Fletcher lay motionless on the schoolhouse floor, his unseeing eyes staring at the ceiling. It was over, but the memory would linger. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms, until the sheriff and his deputies, alerted by one of Hank's ranch hands, arrived to take control of the situation. Statements were given, the body removed, and finally, Hank and Amelia were allowed to return to the ranch. Mrs. Wilkins fussed over them, preparing hot tea and insisting Amelia take a warm bath to settle her nerves. Later, wrapped in a thick shawl and seated before the fire, Amelia found herself unable to stop the tears that had been threatening all evening. Hank sat beside her, saying nothing, simply offering his solid presence as comfort. When she tried to hide her tears, embarrassed by the display of emotion, he gently brushed them away with his thumb. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said softly. "Not with me." Amelia looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. "I was so afraid he would hurt you. I was thinking the same thing about you." Hank took her hands in his. "I realized something today, Amelia. Life out here is unpredictable, dangerous sometimes. We never know what tomorrow might bring." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I've been carrying this around for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's. I'd be honored if you would wear it." Amelia's breath caught. "Hank." "I love you, Amelia Nelson. I think I have since that first day when you stepped out from behind that boulder, scared but so brave." He smiled, remembering. "Will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner in everything?" Joy bubbled up inside Amelia, washing away the fear and tension of the day. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, with all my heart." Hank slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and protection. They were married on Christmas Eve in the schoolhouse, decorated with paper stars and pine boughs. The entire community turned out for the celebration. The children from Amelia's school singing carols as she walked down the makeshift aisle to where Hank waited, his face alight with love and pride. As they exchanged vows, Amelia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place and this man. She'd come west, seeking purpose and adventure. She'd found danger and hardship, yes, but also a love deeper and truer than anything she could have imagined. In the spring, they added a room to the ranch house specifically for Amelia's growing library. By summer, rumors were circulating that the schoolteacher was expecting, rumors confirmed when Hank began building a cradle in the evenings after dinner. Their daughter, Grace, was born the following winter, with Mrs. Wilkins serving as midwife and Hank pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. When he was finally allowed in to see his wife and newborn child, The look of wonder on his face made Amelia fall in love with him all over again. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully taking the tiny bundle into his arms, "just like her mother." As the years passed, the Lawson ranch prospered. 2 more children joined the family, a boy they named Thomas after Hank's father, and another girl, Eleanor. The small schoolhouse was eventually replaced by a larger building that served as both school and community center. Amelia continued to teach, instilling in her students, including her own children, a love of learning and a respect for the written word. Hank expanded his cattle operation and became known throughout the region for his fair dealings and innovative ranching methods. Through it all, their love remained the cornerstone of their lives. They weathered droughts and blizzards, economic hardships and personal losses. They celebrated triumphs and joys, watched their children grow, and eventually welcomed grandchildren to the ranch that had become the heart of the community. On their 25th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the same porch where they'd first acknowledged their feelings for each other, Hank took Amelia's hand, now marked with the signs of years of hard work and loving care. "Any regrets?" he asked, his hair now gray but his eyes still bright with the same love that had captured her heart so many years ago. Amelia thought of the young woman who had fled Boston seeking adventure and purpose. She thought of the terror of her encounter with Fletcher and the joy of finding love in this harsh but beautiful land. She thought of their children, now grown, and the lives they had built together. "Not one," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Every tear, every fear, every moment of doubt led me here to you, and I wouldn't change a single step of the journey." As the sun set over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in familiar hues of gold and crimson, Hank wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders and held her close, saying nothing, just staying by her side as he had for a quarter century, and as he would for all the days to come.